Welcome to Love, Money, Control with Dean Hedeker, reinventing estate planning. Brought to you by Hedeker Law, serving Greater Chicagoland for over 30 years. And now, here are your co-hosts, Matt Halloran and Dean Hedeker.
Hello, I'm Matt Halloran from Top Advisor Radio. Today I'm talking to Dean Hedeker, estate planning and tax attorney with over 35 years of experience in serving the Greater Chicagoland. Today we're going to talk about the top 5 mistakes that people make with their estate. So Dean, if you don't mind, I'd like for you to start by defining what is an estate.
Matt, an estate basically consists of everything that you own. Your house, your car, your stocks, your bonds, your IRAs, all the possessions you have. And then the other thing is all the people who you love and you hold dear. Okay. That's your estate.
Okay. So what is one of the biggest mistakes that people make with their estate?
Number one mistake that people make, Matt, is they fail to do any planning at all. It is amazing how many people we see come in here and have absolutely no estate planning, and it has nothing to do with the size of the estate. Probably the biggest example of that, the recent example, is the estate of Prince, the musician. Look at that. He passed away, died, no estate planning. And now everybody's coming out of woodwork.
Yeah, they are really coming out of the woodwork. You know, I've heard other people say that people take more time planning their vacation than they do for their estate or their financial planning, for that matter.
Well, actually, it's kind of funny. Usually it's when they're having a long vacation, just before they go on vacation, that they want to get their estate planning done. So my point is that you're right, that people will plan for hours and hours and hours, days, weeks on their vacations. But when it comes to their estate planning, they always push it back on the back burner. And the reason is, quite simply, is people never think they're going to die. And, I can understand that. But, the other thing we need to plan for is disability. People often forget that they need to plan for their own disability. And that's the thing that I think is sadly missing.
So that's the second one. So they don't plan for disability. Now, when people think of disability, and I know when I do, I immediately think of being paralyzed or, losing a limb. But that's not the sort of disability you're talking about here, is it?
Not at all, Matt. What we're talking about is mental incapacity. And all this really means, in plain English, is that we don't recognize our husband, we don't recognize our wife, we don't recognize who our kids are. We have no idea. And it's kind of like we've gone on a mental vacation, so to speak. And so the point is we need to have things in place for people to handle things in the event we have this mental vacation. And that mental vacation can be temporary. I've had a client that I can think of, she had a stroke. Half a year later, she came back, and it's though you would never know she had a stroke. So that was a temporary vacation. And then it could be a more permanent variety where you become incapacitated, and then several years later you pass away. I think the other thing, though, in this is that all too often people think they've got their planning done because they named beneficiaries on their assets. And for example, I had a CPA in yesterday, and the CPA said, I don't need any planning. I've got all my beneficiaries on my IRAs. I got my house in joint tenancy. I die, everything goes to my wife. I said, okay. Again, what happens if you go on a mental vacation? What happens if you become incapacitated? What happens then? And he suddenly became very quiet.
So who deems somebody mentally unable to make decisions?
Good question. Ultimately, it becomes the court and the court system. And that's the thing that we want to avoid.
Okay.
I think the worst thing that can happen is in this failure to plan. And the failure to plan is failure to plan for your death, failure to plan your disability. We don't want the court involved in this situation, because I can't think of anything that's more intrusive in somebody's private finances than the court. So that's who controls it. But again, if I were to ask 100 people on the street, 100 people would say we don't want it to go through the court system.
Okay. You used a word a minute ago, tenancy or joint tenancy, and that's number 3 here, but I don't even know what that means. So can you define what that means for us?
Sure. Joint tenancy, what that basically means is that, well, I'll give you an example, actually. You go to a bank, and husband and wife go to a bank, and the bank teller says, husband wants to open up an account. The bank teller says, no, you want to put someone else's name on it. That's what the teller will say. And so the husband says, well, I'll put my wife on there. And so that's what we call a joint tenancy. Two people co-owning property together. And basically what joint tenancy provides is that when one person dies, the survivor gets the assets. Now, where it causes problems in estate planning is if you have a husband and wife with all their assets in joint tenancy, and the wife dies first, for example, and let's assume they have kids. The wife dies first, for example, husband, several years later, his husband's got the assets, several years later, he marries somebody else. And now what he does is he takes those assets and puts them in joint tenancy with his new wife. Guess what happens now? Now what happens is, and I'll tell you stories about this. Husband dies, the assets go to the new wife. The kids from the first marriage come into my office. The kids tell me this tale of woe of how their stepmother now has all the assets, and they want me to sue the stepmother. And sadly, I basically say to them, there's really not much I can do. And so it's a very, very difficult situation. And you really don't want to rely on these joint tenancies to do your estate planning. But I can tell you this, a lot of people come in here with all their assets in joint tenancy, and they think that has protected them. It hasn't.
That can happen on the flip side, though, too, that your first wife or first husband passes, and then you remarry, but you don't title, right? You don't redo your estate plan. So the joint tenancy, does that still apply for the first wife unless you or the first husband?
Okay, so what happens is the first spouse dies, the survivor now has all the assets, and now survivor has basically no planning. They're in a situation now like Prince.
Right.
They have a new wife, we'll say, but it's kind of like Prince. And now the question is if they die, the question is who gets the assets? And Illinois law in that situation would basically provide that 1/3 of it would go to a spouse. I take it back. Half of it would go to spouse, and half of it would go to kids.
Okay.
But again, that's not a result that anybody wants. And again, the other issue is nobody's planned for disability.
Right. Right.
Again, there's this focus on planning for death, and it's not the right thing.
So we've been talking about the top 5 mistakes people make with their estate. So we've talked about they don't have an estate plan. They fail to plan for disability. The reliance on joint tenancy. And number 4, you were just talking about the kids. So what is the 4th mistake that people usually make with their estate?
Well, I'll tell you this, Matt. The big issue here is that we're living in a day where we have millions of lawsuits filed, from creditors. We also have 50% of the marriages, at least 50% of the marriages ending in divorce. And so the biggest thing is there are always people trying to grab these assets. So the way this works is the kids inherit the assets, and if the kids are married, many times those assets they've inherited basically become marital property, and then there's a divorce. I mean, think about it. Your son-in-law now becomes your ex-son-in-law, and you're dead. I think I would come out of the grave to go after my ex-son-in-law.
Sure.
But my point is that because there's a failure to plan for that, what happens is the ex-son-in-law gets the marital estate. And I can tell you another story. I remember having a client come in. He was a physician that came from the old country, came from Italy. He's got his kids around the table, and he says, and the kids even brought their spouses, he says, Dean, I want to make the in-laws the outlaws. That's what we want to do. I agree. So That's the thing. And then we want to protect the kids if they get sued or anything like that too. But the lawsuits occur, but it's the divorce that occurs far more often. Again, we want to protect from both of those things. Okay. Otherwise, the kids lose their inheritance.
Well, IRAs are a big deal. You talked about that already, and we've talked about that in a previous radio show and podcast. So talk to me a little bit about this fifth reason, because we talk about disability, and I can't stress that enough, that people don't truly understand that planning for disability is much more important than just planning for your ultimate demise. But this number 5 mistake that people make with their estates is something I think goes, people just look over it, right? They just don't pay attention to it. So tell us what this is.
Very overlooked. Here's the deal with the IRAs. First of all, you got to understand what your IRA, let's assume you got $300,000 in your IRA. You have to understand that $300,000 isn't $300,000. $200,000 is yours, and $100,000 of it's the government's. Why is that? Because the government is going to get their tax money. Sooner or later, getting their tax money. So, it's kind of like a house. A house, you have a mortgage on there. Your house, you don't own your whole house. Part of your house is owned by the bank. Well, the fact is with this mortgage, though, is that as the IRA grows in value, so too does the government's take on the IRA. That grows at the same rate. So the first thing we got to understand is that the IRA's, part of it is yours and part of it is the government's. And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that in the estate planning that we plan for the taxation on that IRA and we cut the government off. We want to get rid of them. And I wish I could get rid of them totally, but I want to cut down the share they take. So the key is that we want to plan for that IRA. And again, it's planning for the tax issue in the IRA. And as you mentioned, planning for what happens in the event that I, as the IRA owner, I become incapacitated, I become disabled. Because even though I've named my wife as the beneficiary, she only gets it in the event I die. Again, how do people get to that IRA? How does she get to the IRA if I'm incapacitated? That's the issue. So we want to plan for the income taxation on the IRA. And this is very, very technical, and there's some very specific rules that need to be addressed. And then we also want to plan for the incapacity or disability on the IRA.
Okay. So today we talked about the top 5 mistakes that people make with their estate. Today we talked about number 1, that they don't have an estate plan, much like our recent example, which is Prince. Number 2, that they fail to plan for disability. And when you go back and listen to this again, which I highly recommend everybody does, pay attention to this disability aspect because it's something that's overlooked often. The reliance on joint tenancies, number 3. Number 4 is making sure that the kids are taken care of, that they don't lose the inheritance due to divorce or to creditors. And the last one is to failure to put the IRA in the right language so that if you are disabled, that your spouse or significant other can access it. So did I miss anything there, Dean?
No, Matt, I think we did a great job. You did a fantastic job asking the questions. And it was an excellent interview.
Awesome. Thank you for being on the show again. And we're going to continue to interview Dean Hedeker as we go out throughout this year. But if you have any questions and would like to talk to Dean about what we talked about today, Dean, can you give them their contact information, please?
Sure. They can call us at 1-800-201-9250, or they can engage us on the internet. You can reach us at www.hedekerlaw.com. That's HEDEKERLAW.com.
There's a whole bunch of good talking to you too. There's some great stuff on their website, some good papers and some good more research, and there'll be a lot more podcasts on that site. So thank you, Dean Hedeker, the estate planning attorney and tax attorney who's had over 35 years of serving the greater Chicagoland area with all of the stuff we talked about today. We'll see you on the other side.
Thanks for listening to Love Money Control, brought to you by Hedeker Law, serving greater Chicagoland for over 30 years. Get the assistance you need to put a comprehensive estate plan in place today and protect your family's future. Download our free estate planning worksheet for creating a secure future at hedekerlaw.com.